This right here, where we're standing, is called depressed space. So a depressed space is a space that is lower than the space that is all around it. And because it's lower, the spaces around it, or the information about it, there's a lot of information about the spatial composition of the spaces around it that is hidden from us. We don't really understand exactly what's on top of this plane up here, and there could be other enemies back there. Threats can come from above, and it's a direction that we often don't really keep our eyes on because we're used to sort of dealing with things on ground level, and so realizing that there could be threats up here is very unsettling. We feel exposed. It's easier for us to be spotted by threats that are above us. There's a feeling of, in a space like this, there's also a feeling of loss of power. So, on a flat plane, it's easy to just walk out wherever you want. But in a space like this, unless you can fly, it takes time and affordances like ramps, platforms, ladders, stairs, to access those higher areas. You can't just do them readily. So, as opposed to if we look at what I would call elevated space here, so we are at a higher place compared to the space where the skeleton's standing right there. This is the opposite of depressed space, of course. Elevated space is space that's higher than the surrounding spaces. So from this higher perspective, we have a lot more information about the surrounding spaces. We can spot threats very easily, and it's harder for them to spot us. We have also a feeling of power here. We, in addition to feeling like we have a lot of knowledge here and feeling a little bit hidden, we also feel like we have like the power to drop down on them easily. So if enemies are down below us, we can shoot at them, we can drop down to them without them being aware, and it's easy to take advantage of gravity, assuming that it's not too far of a drop. We can quickly drop down to a lower space from a higher one, as opposed to trying to go the other way, which is basically from down to up, is definitely a lot harder. And of course, as I mentioned, as far as like how visible we are, basically our exposure when we're down below tends to be, we tend to be a lot more exposed, and so where enemies are up high, we can only really be safe when we are close to a wall. And so this really limits the area that we feel safe in moving around, as opposed to when we're talking about elevated spaces and we're on the higher end of things, we have a lot more maneuverability. And this even goes above and beyond whether or not we're actually like looking up or looking down, that sort of thing. So, take a look at how this might make you feel for this prospect space, for instance. So this is standard prospect space. I'm at ground level, and there's a feeling of discomfort here because I'm out in the open. But if we were to raise our position to sort of this higher position, what we have now is a feeling of that we've now at an advantage. We feel somewhat more protected, and as I mentioned before, higher perspectives also give us more information about the shapes around us. We can better plan things. So as you can see, I'll scoot back here, and now here I can see so much of like this tree and this rock area up here. So I mentioned a little bit about this just particular phenomena, a couple weeks ago in week 5, talking about just perspective on shapes. And this is a front view, which this building right here, which is it's more of an impressive view. This is an imposing sort of thing, this building against you. And a lot of sort of presentations of buildings and architecture, when you come at a building straight forward, it's because they want their building to look impressive. But it's also less descriptive. And then if we looked from the side, it's even worse because now, or I'd say, well, you'd actually see a little bit extra detail here that you don't see from the side, but you are also, there's a lot of information that's hidden from you. as opposed to if we were looking at an oblique view, which is from an angle like this, versus an oblique elevated view right here. So elevation, of course, gives us more information about it. So just to sort of wrap up about spatial conditions, just kind of what we have to work with. So prospect, narrow, and intimate spaces, elevated versus depressed, high versus low ceiling plane, chaos and order. So we talked a little bit about this in composition, but there's this space right here, which essentially is just a bunch of noise, objects that don't really have a much organization to how they're placed in the environment. As opposed to here, there's a much more sense of order here. So when I presented this back in lecture 5, I think I very much sort of presented this as essentially chaos bad, order is good. And that's not really once you sort of get past. I think what's really important is to learn how to properly order a space, because that's really a difficult skill to be able to grasp. But once you do grasp it, and once you feel like you are able to create spaces at will that feel ordered, then now it's time to sort of pose the question, do I always want my spaces to be ordered? If the space is sort of chaotic like this does give a sense of confusion to the player. And there's definitely times where you are going to want to be able to use that, but it just essentially, like any tools of artistry, I guess you want to be able to use these options at will and not accidentally. So back to spatial conditions. So that's chaos versus order. There's also sort of light versus dark. And while it seems obvious that sort of bright light is sort of a happy, cheery place, and dark is scary, that sort of thing, it definitely sort of flips around. I mean, just when we talk about prospect space, at least the example that I gave was a nice and bright environment, and that feels like you're out and exposed, and a darker space might feel more comforting. Or think about gameplay where you are there's enemies up on towers and they have spotlights shining down on you, and in that case you have a case where sort of the light is the danger area and you don't want to be in the light. And so essentially every single one of these conditions, you may be asking yourself, why, how can I trust using any of these if they can mean both one and then the opposite? So we'll get to that in a moment. But so other things, hostile versus friendly, that's a little more vague, but there's a certain sense to making it feel like your environment is hostile. There's open pits everywhere, bottomless pits, there's spikes, that sort of stuff, versus hostile, versus a friendly environment that might have more affordances, that might have more resources to find, more rewards, that sort of thing, less risks, and as a sense of sort of a natural versus artificial, which is something that we often play with in working on The Last of Us, for instance. That's what I've got for spatial conditions. Now let's move on to shape language.